That kind of, wow, man. I'm just glad he's my friend and not my enemy. The next person that needs to come up here, make your way up. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Gun Owners of America. And I'm proud to call him friend tonight. And I assure you, he's a friend to every one of y'all.
Yep.
I promise you. Needs no introduction. Please make welcome Mr. Eric Pratt.
Well, I want to say thank you to Eddie and all of BamaCarry for having me. It's truly been wonderful to be here. Quite frankly, I'd take any excuse to get out of the DC area, so I really do appreciate the invitation. I know that many of you would never want to live in the DC area. I actually stole my wife from this area, took her up there kicking and screaming. Says it's too cold and too liberal up there. Actually, I say this area, she's near this area. I mean, you know where LA is, right? I mean, there you go. I was going to say, if you say Los Angeles, you ain't from around here. That's right, lower Alabama, but not Alabama. Did you know that the folks in Florida have stolen your state name? Right, the Panhandle part? Yeah, that's lower Alabama to, they call it God's country. Anyway, it's good folks there, and you know, we love to come back. It's good to be with like-minded people, because I tell you what, where we live, people are crazy. I mean, I have to be there because of my job, okay? So I'm there, I do it, but we're like islands in the, you know, an ocean of just fanaticism and anti-gun stupidity. It's really amazing. In fact, just last month, just to give you an example of this, there was a DC comedian, and right there that screams anti-gun liberal, doesn't it, right? Anyway, he's on a DC street corner. This is a true story. He's held up by two guys with a gun. So he was robbed but uninjured. Well, today, he's seeing life much, much differently. He says before he never saw the need to have a gun. Now he wants a gun and he wants to carry a gun. I mean, this is a DC comedian now wants to carry a gun. What's the, you know, hell is frozen over. Now, I got to tell you, Gun Owners of America was the original group at the federal level supporting constitutional carry back in the 1990s. And so who knows, when this guy, you know, when he gets denied by the DC government, heck, maybe he'll become a GOA member, you know, join that constitutional carry wave. So maybe we'll see him become one of our newest members. But you guys know, I mean, this is a war of ideas that we're fighting, and we've been hearing this all day long today as we've been talking about this. And all across the country. I mean, it's not just up in the DC area, although certainly what happens there affects everybody. But it's everywhere. I mean, in past years, we've heard crazy things like, you don't need a gun, don't use a gun for protection in the home. All you need is wasp spray. Oh yeah, that was fantastic advice given out by NBC News. Or how about you ladies? What do you think about this advice? You don't need a gun to stop a rapist. Just urinate on yourself. How demeaning is that? That's what, during some of the battles we fought out west, that's for women who testified for the right to carry, that's what they were told. Now, I got to tell you, and you may not like to hear this, but even Alabama's not immune from this kind of thinking. There's still some craziness down here, and I know you guys know that, but you remember one Alabama school's answer to mass shootings? They actually sent a letter home with the kids, and I'm not making this up. Send your kids to school with cans of corn. Yeah. If there's a mass shooter, we will throw those cans. Oops, sorry. Throw those cans at them. Oh my goodness. Well, if that's such a good idea, I wonder why cops aren't carrying cans of corn, right? Next thing we're going to see people charged with CCC, right? Carrying corn concealed. Of course, and then you know it's not going to stop there, because then they're going to start talking about can control. They're going to want to impose background checks at the grocery store before you buy peas and corn and things like that. then I don't know. I mean, maybe on the other hand, they have a point with this can idea. I mean, isn't it true that mass shooters avoid food pantries for this very reason, because of all the cans that are there? I don't know. So maybe it could work. Not. Like, this is the lunacy that we are dealing with. These ideas for, not guns, but this. And it's absolutely crazy. It's silly. It's laughable. It's also very deadly. Because disarmament is very deadly. And that's the thing that GOA is fighting every day. Now, on to a little bit more serious matters. Eddie asked me to discuss what it is that we need to do in order to restore our rights and our freedoms. And why is it that we have failed to actually retain and keep the heritage that our founding fathers have passed on to us? So I want to address that, and I think I can in just one word. And then I'll do a mic drop and walk off. No, I won't do it. In one word, what is killing us, especially with the Second Amendment, in one word, it is compromise. Compromise is killing the Second Amendment. Now, I want you to imagine this scenario. A thief sticks a gun in a New York liberal's stomach and demands $100. Now, we know what would happen if that occurred here in Alabama. Right? I mean, right here, a lot of us are packing heat. That liberal wouldn't be around for long, right? He'd be horizontal real quickly. But I did mention this is a New York liberal, so he's obviously disarmed. Thief sticks a gun in his stomach and says, give me your money. Well, I want you to imagine this scenario. New York liberal doesn't have a gun. There's nothing he can do, but he's quick on his feet and he's using his wits. And so he says, I want you to consider this. I've got, at home, I've got kids, I've got a wife, they need food, they need clothes, I've got bills to pay. So Mr. Thief, would you just settle for $50 and we'll call it even? Now that's a ridiculous scenario, right? Of course that would never happen. But imagine the thief agrees. Could you see the victim returning home and telling his wife, I just met the nicest man outside of the grocery store. He let me keep 50 of my dollars. Right? I mean, that's obviously a ridiculous scenario. I mean, it's a robbery. You can't excuse that. You got to call it out. You got to hold them accountable. But unfortunately, that very scenario is exactly what has been happening with our rights, and specifically with the gun compromisers in the gun community. The anti-gun establishment wants to rob us of the rights that God has given to us. They want to take what has been rightfully given to us, but for too long, there have been compromisers who have said, well, maybe you can't have all of what you're demanding, but we'll give you part of what you would like. In other words, put it another way, they settle for gun control light. Gun control light, and so they don't hold the thieves accountable, because after all, the thieves were nice enough to let us keep some of our rights. If you don't believe me, you can just go online, you go to our website at gunowners.org, see how we've rated congressional candidates all across the country, which is publicly available on our website, and then compare it to other organizations where grade inflation takes place. And you will see what I mean, where there is this tendency not to punish those who are stealing our rights. Well, here's the problem with that. If we continue down the road of compromise, there's not going to be any rights to be defending. At some point along the line, we're going to give it all away. And even more fundamentally than that, and it's been stated up here several times today already, our rights don't come from the government. Our rights don't depend on popular opinion. Our rights don't even come from a piece of paper, as good as that piece of paper, the Constitution, may be. Our rights do not come from the Constitution. As the Declaration said, as our founding fathers said, our rights are given to us by the Creator. Our rights come from God. And so because of that, there is no compromising. Because of that, our rights are inalienable. That's what that means. Inalienable means they can't be taken away. They cannot be infringed in any way. They are gifts from God. In fact, that's why the Second Amendment says shall not be infringed. It's directly taking that idea from the Declaration of Independence that our rights come from God. They're not privileges to be handed out or recalled at any point. But here's what happens. The compromisers say, well, I don't own a bump stock and they're novelties anyway, so who cares if they ban them? The compromiser says, well, what harm is a little old background check going to do? I mean, it's instant anyway. What's the big deal? What harm? Well, just ask the family of Carol Bound of New Jersey, who was being threatened by her violent ex-boyfriend, who is an ex-felon. Her life was being threatened, and so she got a restraining order against him, but she figured, you know, what's a good a piece of paper going to be if he shows up and attacks me? So she went to purchase a firearm. Well, sadly, she lives in New Jersey, and they take their time with their background checks. See, this is what happens when you force good people to prove their innocence to the government. There are consequences for this. And days bled into days, weeks turned into weeks. Finally, over a month later, no, they didn't clear her, they didn't give her the right, the privilege to own a gun, no, not yet. And instead, her old boyfriend showed up at her home and stabbed her to death. I guess the thinking was, if I can't have you, then nobody can. And that was it. See, this is the consequence for compromise. This is what happens when good people have to get permission in order to exercise their rights. Well, if we compromise our rights to the anti-gunners, then wherever it is that we draw the line, that becomes the starting point for their demands the next time. I mean, take the NICS system, okay? Gun Owners of America has opposed the NICS system, the FBI background check, from its inception. The background check system is an infringement. It is an unconstitutional infringement upon your God-given rights. Do you support constitutional carry? Do you support the idea that, hey, I shouldn't have to prove my innocence to the government in order to exercise a God-given right to carry a firearm? Well, why would we support that then for purchasing a firearm? It's the same thing. In fact, quite frankly, what other right is there that we have to prove our innocence to the government? To exercise our rights. I didn't have to get a background check to stand up here. I'm married to a very lovely wife. I didn't have to go through a background check or screening to make sure I wasn't going to be a wife beater. You know, we have 10 children. We didn't have to go through background checks to make sure that we weren't going to be abusive parents. What other right do we do this? Actually, I watch MSNBC because I have to for you guys, okay? They've actually gone there now, talking about how we need background checks for before parents have kids. See, this is eventually where this crazy line of thinking goes. If you allow, a little leaven leavens the whole loaf, right? If you allow it in one place, eventually it's going to seep through everywhere else. And besides, background checks are a registration system, and I don't want the government knowing who has the guns. So GOA opposed the background check system. Well, that was the 1990s. I told you, wherever the line is drawn, because there was another federal gun organization that helped write the law as a compromise, and wherever you draw that line, that becomes the battle for the next time. And so 10 years later, they wanted more. Anti-gunners wanted more. 2007 comes along, it's the NICS Improvement Amendments Act. They always come up with these great names, the NICS Improvement. Who could be against improvement? Well, we redubbed it the Veterans Disarmament Act because we knew that was exactly what it was going to do, because we analyzed not only the bill, this was always cracks me up. We had people saying, oh, GOA is fear-mongering, because I read the bill and the bill doesn't mention veterans anywhere. Do your homework. You can't just read the bill, you've got to read the legislation, existing code that is being amended, and the federal regulations that are going to be implemented. And quite frankly, that's what we get sent to Washington to do. That's why I have to live there. That's what we do. And in doing all that homework, we saw, you know what, this is going to affect a lot of veterans. And now that the other shoe is dropped, you know the rest of the story, don't you? If you've been following this, more than 257,000 military veterans that we sent off to war to fight for our country, they come back dealing with PTSD and the stress from what they saw in combat. They go for counseling, and a guardian is appointed to handle their finances, and then they're treated as a mental defective. And so now they're disqualified from purchasing a firearm. So what harm can a little compromise do? Well, ask those 257,000 military veterans who are suffering from PTSD. Or ask the people who try to buy a firearm and have no idea why they've been denied, and the FBI may not tell them for months and months and months, but then when they finally find out, it turns out that it was merely an outstanding traffic ticket. Because did you know, let's say you're traveling with your family, you're in another state on vacation, you're caught speeding. I know you never speed, right? But let's just theoretically, this happens, and you know, after a great vacation, you go back home, you forget about that ticket, you don't pay the fine, you don't, in any way respond. Well, you know what happens then? A warrant is put out for your arrest. And then you are listed as a fugitive from justice. Now, not a lot of people realize that until they get denied their right to buy a firearm, and they can't figure out what it would be in their record. Do you know what the number 2 category is for the most denials under the FBI background check system? It's fugitives from justice. And in that category is included outstanding traffic tickets. So what's wrong with a little compromise? Ask the veterans. Ask those with outstanding traffic tickets. Or ask those people who just simply have the same name as a bad guy. You know that 95% of the initial denials under the NICS system are false positives. People who should not be denied. We are spending millions and millions of dollars on the background check system, and 95% of the initial denials are false positives, people who should not be denied. Well, now there is legislation in Congress. In fact, it was mentioned a little bit earlier, and here's how it gets worse, because now here, fast forward 10 years from the Veterans Disarmament Act, now there's legislation in Congress known as Fix NICS. Well, of course there's need to fix it, because it was grounded on a false premise anyway, where we shouldn't be forcing people to get permission to exercise their rights. And because we're doing that, there's tremendous problems. So now they want to spend $2/3 billion, Congress does, $2/3 billion to fix the problem. Well, this means you're going to get more veterans, more outstanding traffic violators, and more innocents with the same name being thrown into the system, because that's what that $2/3 billion is going to do. It's going to pay the states and pay the federal agencies to scrounge up every possible name that should be in the system, and if they don't, the states and the federal agencies are going to be penalized. So more military veterans, more outstanding traffic tickets, more innocents with the same name. I'll give you an example of that. California, we just had a great sheriff in here addressing us. Over in California, John Lope carries a gun for a living, obviously. He's a sheriff. Well, he served honorably in the armed forces, 33 years as a state trooper. He's never committed a crime, but guess what happened when he went to buy a firearm for his personal collection? He was denied. Denied by the FBI background check system, and they can't tell him why it was denied. They don't even know. They said, you must have the same name as a bad guy. But when he finally looked into it and finally was able to get an answer. Now, some gun owners have, and this is the gun owning, the pro-gun compromisers have looked at that legislation I described and said, well, actually, this is going to help us, because it tells the Attorney General that if there is incorrect information, like Sheriff John Lope, it needs to be corrected within 60 days. Okay, now that sounds good, right? Until you remember I said earlier you got to read the existing legislation. The existing code, federal code, statutes at large, Section G, says the Attorney General, when there's incorrect information, is required to immediately correct the information. In fact, it says it a couple times. Immediately correct the information. Now, wives, if you ask your husband to take out the trash, would you prefer immediately or 60 days? Yeah, I know the answer to that one. Happy wife, happy life, right? Come on, what is the better scenario for the Attorney General? To immediately fix it, as in the current law, or 60 days? How is that making the situation better? See, people don't read. They may read the bill, and I say kudos for reading the legislation, but if you don't read the underlying law that's being amended, how can you really comment wisely on what we have? Not to mention the fact, anyway, that the whole fix NICS issue is, the problem is we don't need to fix NICS, we need to end NICS. We need to repeal the FBI background system because compromise is killing us. I would add one other thing, too, that legislation I was telling you about. Remember how I said it will penalize the states and federal agencies if they don't scrounge up every name? When it comes to the requirement for the Attorney General, there's no penalizing, there's no sanctions if he doesn't fix the situation within 60 days. So they're going to force the states to throw every possible conceivable name, which could end up affecting people in this room. But then when the Attorney General doesn't fix it, if he doesn't fix it within 60 days, there's no sanction there. How can you even say that that's fair? Back to bump stocks, though. Who cares about an issue like that? I mean, it's just a novelty anyway. I've talked to you some about that here this weekend already, and you're like, yeah, I have one. It's in the closet. I don't really use it. Here's the problem with this issue, if you really haven't looked into it or thought about it this much. With bump stocks and bump firing, every piece of, and right now the ATF is considering whether to ban or regulate these items. Every piece of legislation that I've seen, either at the federal level or at the state level, bans any device that can help accelerate the rate of fire of a firearm. Accelerate the rate of fire of a firearm. Now, you know what kind of things can accelerate the rate of a firearm? Exactly. Shoestring, belt loop, rubber bands, even your finger. Right. Have you seen videos of, maybe you've done it yourself, where you can bump fire an AR-15 or other firearm without using a bump stock, just simply in the way you hold it, allowing the recoil to help fire it. And it's not turning it into a machine gun at all. So all these things now come into play, not to mention the fact, well, what could an anti-gun administration do with this? I mean, could you see them arguing, well, a 30-round magazine allows you to fire more rapidly than, say, 3 10-round magazines, so the bigger magazines are banned. Bam. I wouldn't expect the Trump administration to do that, but how about an Oprah Winfrey administration? The Lord forbid. Nancy Pelosi said, banning bump stocks is a step towards more gun control. For the first time in my life, I actually agree with Nancy Pelosi. She's right. It is a step towards more gun control. What an awkward situation for the pro-gun compromisers. Do they realize the company that they're keeping? Nancy Pelosi, Dianne Feinstein, Charles Schumer, every single one of them support a ban on bump stocks. They also support the fix NICS legislation. Really, it's an unfortunate thing, but the compromisers and traitors have been there all throughout history. They go by different names. Their names are Neville Chamberlain, Brutus, Benedict Arnold, Judas, right? These are the names of famous ones in the past, but quite frankly, their spirit lives on wherever and whenever you hear somebody say, I support the Second Amendment, but who needs blank? Folks, we do not have a Bill of Needs. We do not have a Bill of Needs. We have a Bill of Rights. And even those rights don't come from that document. That document protects those rights. Those rights weren't invented by us, they weren't invented by our founding fathers. They were simply stating the rights that already existed that come from God Himself. So, with all this as a background, knowing that it's compromise that is killing us, what can we do to reclaim our rights? What can be done? Well, if compromise is killing us, then 2 words is the remedy. No compromise. Absolutely. Amen. No compromise. You know, over the years, the compromisers have told us, well, you can't be too rigid. You know, every now and then you got to compromise a little, you got to look reasonable. Have you ever heard these arguments? Right? Well, let me tell you a couple of times where, and quite frankly, there's many, but I just only have time to mention a couple, when GOA didn't appear reasonable to the compromisers. And so I'll give you one offensive battle that we've engaged in and one defensive battle real quickly here. Offensively, in terms of constitutional carry, you know, it didn't always used to be constitutional carry, or called that. It used to be called freedom. But back in the 90s, when the movement first started, it wasn't called constitutional carry. Anybody here involved in the fight remember what it was called? It was named after the original constitutional carry state, Vermont. I heard it, yeah. Vermont-style carry. And like I said earlier, we were the first group at the federal level that was on board pushing this hard. In fact, I think that name came out of our office, Vermont-style carry, although I like constitutional carry much better. Anyway, we started pushing this in states around the country. You know, hey, let's do it like they do in Vermont. They got a real little murder rate there. Must be working for them, you know. And so we're pushing. We start getting calls from state legislators around the country, and they said, you know what? We've got a real problem in my state, because the NRA rep here in my state is saying they only want a permit system, and that if we, not only if we introduce the Vermont-style carry, but if anyone votes for it, we will get knocked down or maybe even given an F rating. And our answer to them was, we will go to bat for you. We will mobilize the grassroots to support you. We are going to be fully behind you to do whatever we can, not only to keep getting you reelected, but to get this legislation passed. In fact, we have some of those letters that these state legislators wrote us. Some of them are still up on our website. So anyway, we pushed and pushed and pushed, even when in much of the gun community, it didn't seem reasonable to be pushing something that didn't require a permit. Well, that was then. Now, today, we have 14 states that call themselves constitutional carry states. And Lord willing, Alabama's going to be number 15. But you see, refusing to compromise is the best way to take back the rights that have been taken from us. You do the right thing, and it doesn't matter. It's regardless of the obstacles that you face, regardless of what the compromisers are saying about you. So that was an offensive battle where we've seen tremendous fruit come just from not backing down. Let me give you a defensive battle that we were involved in, and I know you all are going to remember this, because it happened right after the very tragic shooting in Sandy Hook. And if you were involved in the gun rights fight back then, you remember feeling like the whole world was against you. And I tell you, I mean, I love my job because I'm passionate about freedom, but those were some really hard months because the entire world was looking at us saying, you're responsible for those deaths up there in that school. And what especially made it hard was the turncoats. I mean, we knew that, the media, and especially the foreign media, were against us, but then you had legislators in the Congress that were turning, that they had been pro-gun, it had appeared that way, all their career, and now they were saying things like, well, now I realize, based on this, the time is coming, we need some reasonable limitations. And, you just felt that dagger going into you, so those were real hard times. Well, GOA did not back down. We did not compromise. In fact, we got wind of compromise that was taking place, and we exposed it. And you can, again, you can go to our website at gunowners.org. We still have the open letter that we published because we found out Senator Joe Manchin was, and this is because we have contacts on the Hill, we're up on the Hill, we found out that his office was doing a compromise with a national pro-gun organization, and we put out an open letter and we said, listen, if you are an NRA member, we want you to call your organization, be respectful, be polite, but urge them to not compromise. Tell them not one word of gun control. Call the higher echelons in the organization and urge them to back off of this. This is what the power of grassroots lobbying can do. The New York Times, ironically, did the post-mortem on the no gun control passing. Of course, from their perspective, it was like a sad thing they were reporting. For us, it was an exciting thing. But in their, it was a tremendously long, several-page article, very in-depth. They reported on what happened 1 week after Gun Owners of America put out that open letter. 1 week, the compromise came to an end. Senator Joe Manchin, in fact, he's quoted in the article saying, I was calling James Baker at the NRA and he's not calling me back. And I said, hey, James, what happened? I thought we had a deal here. We almost had a deal here. The deal fell through because they got so many calls, emails, letters saying, please do not compromise. We had turned on the lights and it had been exposed. But it wasn't just the New York Times that wrote about this. Several media organizations, like, here's this one. This was their headline. Democrats blame Gun Owners of America for gun control setback. See, they call it a setback. It was actually a victory. For them, it was a setback. The Examiner, now they're actually on the conservative side. According to conservative staffers, Gun Owners of America was the future generations who will look back to what we're doing today. Let us lay aside every infringement and every compromise that so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. That is our calling to do that. That is the road that we must travel, and we can do this together. If you're not a member of Gun Owners of America, I would encourage you to join with us. We need your voice. The more members we have, the louder voice that we have in Washington. Right now, we are 1.5 million members strong. And our members are making a huge difference, just like BamaCarry. You guys are making a huge difference here in Bama. So I encourage you to go to our website, gunowners.org. If you're doing it on your phone, you just scroll down past the videos, and you can see where to sign up. Sign up for emails as well. That's important too. We will get you involved in this fight, and working together, we will reclaim back our rights. Thank you so much.
Okay, take 10. Take 10, and Chris Ann's next. So y'all don't stay too long. Chris Ann Hall, constitutional lawyer. Hey, we all been waiting for her, right? Speaker of Freedom, began her career as a biochemist, a Russian linguist for the U.S. Army, and a prosecutor for the state of Florida. Chris Ann also practiced First Amendment law for a prominent national nonprofit law firm. She is now president of Liberty First University and travels the country teaching the foundational principles of liberty and our constitutional republic. She is the author of 6 books on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. She also has a nationally syndicated radio show and a cable television show. She's been featured on C-SPAN TV and C-SPAN Book TV. But enough of all this bull. Chris Ann, please come and teach us something.
All right, what do I have to do to make this thing work? Check, there I am. You can take that thing. I'm not gonna do anything but fall over it. He didn't hear me. I was telling Mr. Eric, I said, don't worry, I am called a constitutional purist. The funny thing is, those who call me that try to use use it as a derogatory comment. I kind of choose to think it as a badge of honor. What do you think? Not only that, I am on the Southern Poverty Law Center's list of anti-government extremist groups. Here's the interesting thing. There are 997 groups on that list, and me. I am the only individual who is not actually a group named by individual name by the Southern Poverty Law Center as an anti-government extremist group. And I think that's pretty cool, don't you? Yeah. Hello, BamaCarry. I am so happy to be here. You know why? Because you guys are the epitome of the ideals that our republic was established upon. The ideal that liberty is preserved through self-governance. The understanding that our constitutional republic was created so that liberty could be protected from the bottom up, not from the top down. You are a group of citizens who say, we will stand in defense of our God-given rights, and we're not going to wait for somebody on high to bestow upon us a privilege or a magic word to allow us to do that for ourselves. And I have the privilege and the honor to be here today to teach you just how to do that. I love Mr. Eric's speech about we will not comply, this non-compromise, but I'm going to show you how that works. Not waiting for somebody in Washington, D.C. to agree with you, but standing up as a people who are governing themselves, defending their own rights, looking at those in Washington, D.C. and saying, we don't care if you agree with us or not, this is what we're doing. Because I'm going to show you today how our constitutional republic was created and designed so that you have the power. I am going to teach you the truth of how Alabama not only has the power, the right, but the duty to say, we will defend our rights. We will secure our liberty, whether you agree with us or not.
Amen.
This is the truth that should make every legislator in Alabama, every sheriff in Alabama, every citizen of Alabama want to stand up and say, these are our rights, given to us by God, not by documents, not by legislators or by legislation. And we will defend our liberty, and our liberties shall not be infringed. Now, as I'm teaching you here today, you're going to see things up here. Oh, I have to point it up here, right? No, back up. I am going to be teaching you not the opinions of Chris Ann Hall. There's not a single person in this room that should leave this room today and say, Chris Ann Hall said this about my right to keep and bear arms. We are going to learn from the only true sources: the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the men who wrote it. These are the only legitimate standards, the only legitimate sources. And I will show you a truth today that cannot be denied. I mean, we know this, right? I bet practically everybody in this room can recite this by memory. And if you're in this room and you can't, shame on you. The problem is, screw have a pile of people in America who can read, who do not understand this. Now, there are no $1.50 words in here. I believe a 6th grader could read this and understand every single word in there. But then you got the judges and lawyers who say, well, we can't possibly know what the men who wrote this actually meant. That is a lie. Because when they wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, they wrote reams and reams and reams about what they were writing, why they were writing, and what they intended to achieve through the codification of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So I want to show you, we're going to start off today with showing you some of the words from the men who wrote the Second Amendment. One thing that I hope that we will come away with today is the understanding that there is not a single person in America who has a Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Not a single person in America has a Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Why? Because your rights do not come from the Second Amendment. Your right to keep and bear arms is not created by the Second Amendment. It is recognized by the Second Amendment and secured by the Second Amendment through the people. Samuel Adams says, as we should all know, that our right to keep and bear arms is a natural right. See, he says, among the natural rights of the colonists are these: first, life; second, liberty; third, property, together with the right to protect and the right to support and defend them in the best manner they can. Your right to keep and bear arms stems from the first law of nature, your duty to self-preservation. Because here's the bottom line: if you do not have a right to protect your life, your liberty, and your property, you are a slave to whomever you're waiting to do that for you. And you might have a good sheriff today, but tomorrow, who knows? You are not to be dependent on someone else to secure your self-preservation. Now, that's self-preservation. Are we talking about robbers and rapists? Are we talking about thieves? Well, maybe thieves, but a different kind of thief. Because you see, if you are disarmed, according to George Mason, the father of the Bill of Rights, you are enslaved. See, that was the plan in Great Britain. He says 40 years ago, when the resolution of enslaving America was formed in Great Britain, the British Parliament was advised by an artful man who was governor of Pennsylvania to disarm the people because that was the best and most effectual way to enslave them. But he said, do not do it openly. Weaken them and let them sink gradually. Don't show up on their doorstep to take your guns, because they'll shoot you in the forehead. But the plan was, even in 1745, that the king and parliament pass a law that makes it difficult and sometimes even impossible for the American colonists to purchase firearms and ammunition. One of the plans was that the king would issue a law that said no importation of firearms will be allowed unless they get a permit from the king. And the plan was then to never issue any permits. You see, a permit is a privilege, but it is also the destruction of your right. Because just because they're handing out permits today, what's to make them hand them out tomorrow? We have Noah Webster, the guy who wrote the dictionary, and he says that if you are disarmed, you will be ruled by wickedness. You see, BamaCarry stands for the principles that America is founded upon, that we are not to be ruled over by a government, but the people are to govern themselves and control those in government. And Noah Webster says, you can't do that if you're disarmed. Look at this. You will be ruled over by a standing army. But in America, He says, the supreme power in America cannot enforce any unjust laws. Why? Because the whole body of the people will be armed and will constitute a force superior to any band of troops that can be raised on any pretense by the federal government. He said a force at the command of Congress can enforce no unjust, unconstitutional laws. Why? Because the people will be armed, and the jealousy towards their liberty will inspire them to stand against any unjust, any oppressive, and any unconstitutional law. You see, because if you are disarmed, then the government does not fear you. And if the government does not fear you first, you are not free. Patrick Henry gave that famous speech. What was his famous speech? Give me liberty or give me death. Well, he was also a delegate in the Constitutional Convention, and during the ratification debates and the Bill of Rights and the discussions on the Second Amendment, one of the delegates said, we don't need to codify this Second Amendment. You know why? Because people in America will remember this history that we've been through, and our American future will never allow themselves to be disarmed ever again. Patrick Henry had a little better understanding of human nature, and he said, you know what, I don't like that. And the record reflects that Patrick Henry sneered at the guy and said, oh, sir, we should have fine times indeed if to punish tyrants are only sufficient to assemble the people. Your arms wherewith you could defend yourselves are gone. Have you ever read of any revolution in a nation inflicted by those who have no power against those who do? Because you see, it is a right to keep and bear arms. A natural right, a God-given right, and not a permission. Can we think about this for just a second? A right is a just claim, a legal title, an ownership, the legal power of exclusive possession and enjoyment. Do we have a right to keep and bear arms, or do we have a permission to keep and bear arms? Because the minute you have to sign a permit or pay a penny to get a firearm, you are no longer operating by right, you're operating by permission. And a permission that can be granted by those in power is a permission that can be taken by those in power. It is not just about hunting, it's not just about sports, it's not just about criminals, it is about preserving liberty and overthrowing tyrants. And if you are disarmed, you are enslaved. That is the bottom line. As a matter of fact, Richard Henry Lee said, it is essential that the whole body of the people always bear arms. If something is essential, can you do without it? If you are always doing something, is there ever a moment when you're not doing it? Richard Henry Lee is trying to explain to Alabama that if you are not packing every minute of every day of your life, you are not preserving liberty. And the minute you have to ask permission from anybody, then you don't have a right anymore, you have a privilege. Can I ask you just a simple question before we move on? If you have to ask permission from the government when and where and how you carry, how does that make any sense when they are the reason that you carry? There's only one question that ever needs to be asked in any gun control debate, and here it is. Do you trust those in power, now and forever, to never try to oppress you, to never try to enslave you, to never try to deny your rights? If the answer to that question is no, then the discussion is over. Because gun control is not gun control. It is rights control. People are not anti-gun, they are anti-rights. changed, right? What about all the federal gun laws? What about, look at this, on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Does this look like shall not be infringed to you? Keep going, look at that. Oh, I clicked one too many times. Go on, hello. There we go. Does that look like shall not be infringed to you? Shall not be infringed is the opposite on how our federal government operates today. My goodness, I have an 11-year-old who understands what shall not means. What is the mental disconnect with politicians in D.C.? I think it's us. Samuel Adams said, no people will tamely surrender their liberties, nor be easily subdued when knowledge is diffused and virtue is preserved. He said, but on the contrary, when the people become universally ignorant and debauched in their manners, they will sink underneath their own weight without the aid of foreign invaders. You have lost more liberty from Washington, D.C. than you will ever lose from an illegal immigrant or an ISIS terrorist, and that is a fact.
That's right. That's right.
So how many of you think the federal government's out of control? Some of you don't think that? I'll pray for you. So how do we fix it? How do we not simply believe in the non-compromise? How do we actually function, act, and demand the non-compromise? And I'm going to tell you what, it does not come from Washington, D.C. The greatest check and balance as created by our constitutional republic was not the federal government checking itself. Does that seem ludicrous? How many of you think the founders of America, the writers of our Constitution and our Declaration and our Bill of Rights were smart guys? Would you agree that some of them were maybe even genius? So why would these really smart, genius people develop a system where the only check and balance was itself? You're laughing because it's ridiculous. And it is ridiculous because that's not what they did. The greatest check and balance on federal power comes through the state and local governments. This is the oath of office that everyone takes when they go to work for the government of Alabama. Problem is, I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of Alabama, so long as I continue a citizen thereof. You know what that means? Their oath never ends, doesn't it? How do you keep a promise, that's what an oath is, to support the Constitution of the United States if you don't even understand what it means? Because here's the bottom line. Anyone who will allow a discussion on gun control, anyone who will allow federal gun laws to be enforced in Alabama does not understand that oath. Now maybe it's because they've never been taught, and that's okay, because that ignorance has been floating through America for a very long time. We need to get back to some understandings. We've got to understand that it is the state and the local governments who have the power, the right, and the duty to defend the liberties of the people by controlling the federal government. And it all rests in the understanding of what exactly is a state. So here you go. If you have your pocket constitutions, take them out now. Because remember, this is class. We're here to learn today. And to understand the very beginning of what it means to be Alabama, we're going to go to the Declaration of Independence, the document that announces the creation of the states to determine the meaning of the states. Because who better to tell us the meaning of the states than the people who created them, right? So this is the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assemble, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, by, in the name and the authority of the good what? People. Not king, not Supreme Court, because it doesn't even exist yet, not president, because he doesn't exist yet either. The people. Why? Why do the people have this authority? Because we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator. You see, we are born free. We don't have to ask permission from people to be free. We must simply step up and declare it. And that's what we did. He said, we're free. And in this text, we're learning what a state is not. It says that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. You see, we were colonies, but now we're states. So what's the difference? The difference is very simple. If you live in a colony, you must seek guidance and permission from the central government before you can use your land. You must seek guidance and permission from the central government before you can create laws, before you can have businesses, regulate businesses, create roads, educate your people. You have to seek guidance and permission from the central government if you live in a colony. Anybody feel like Alabama acts like a colony sometimes? Well, here's the good news. Alabama is not a colony. She is a state, free and independent. So what does that mean, though? Free and independent. Continuing now with the Declaration of Independence, we say that these states are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the what? State of what? Great Britain. You see, that word state is not simply synonymous with New Hampshire, Rhode Island, or Virginia. That word state is synonymous with Great Britain, France, and Germany. We created 13 independent sovereign states that carry the same political right and authority as every other independent sovereign country on the planet.
That's right. That is right.
Now look at what our people say, who created our states. Look at the power that they have delegated to the states. Now this is July 4th, 1774. Is there a federal government yet? Are you sure? Say it loud and clear. No, so the only governments that exist are what? The states. So this list of power has to be going to the states. That as free and independent states, meaning every single state created in their individual capacity holds this power. Full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states like Great Britain, France, or Germany may of right do. And this doesn't just apply to the first 13. There is a legal doctrine that called the equal footing doctrine that says every state that is formed entering the Union enters on the same footing as the first 13. Alabama, here is your footprint, power that you hold today. Now I want you to take a mental note and remember this list of power, because it's going to come up again, and it's very important that you remember who owns this power. Who owns this power? The states. Remember, we're going to show you today why the states have the power, the right, and the duty to defend your liberties from anyone, even the federal government. So now that we know what the state is, we need to know what the Constitution is. Legally speaking, as declared by the men who wrote the Constitution is a compact. Now, a compact is a specific kind of contract. A contract is a legally binding agreement between sovereign people. And when you say sovereign people, what I mean is you are sovereign in the eyes of the law. Is Jacob still here? Where are you, Jacob? No, he's gone. Well, Jacob is 10 years old. Can Jacob make a legally binding contract? No, because he's not sovereign in the eyes of the law. But a compact is not just an agreement between sovereign people. A compact is an agreement between legally sovereign governments. And what are the legally sovereign governments that we created prior to the Constitution? The states. That means that the Constitution is a compact between the states. Now, some people try to say that the Constitution is an agreement between the people and the federal government. That is false. And you can prove that false with one simple fact. Let me ask you this question. You all know the answer to this. Was the Constitution ratified by popular vote of the people? No. How was it ratified? By 3/4 of the states. Someone might try to tell you that the Constitution is an agreement between the states and the federal government. That is a temporal impossibility. Because you see, the federal government didn't exist until the Constitution was ratified, right? The federal government is the product of the Constitution. You cannot be a party to a contract if you are the product of the contract, because you cannot sign the contract into legal being if you do not exist until it's signed. Right? Which means we must know that the Constitution is a compact between the states. Legally speaking, the states are the parties to the compact. We know that the central government is the product of the compact, which means that we now know something else very important. The states created the Constitution. The Constitution created the federal government. Doesn't that tell us without denial that the states are the creators of the federal government? How can the creation be superior to the creator? The states created the central government. They created a limited and defined central government. They enumerated its specific powers, and then they did the most important thing they could have ever done. They reserved all other power to themselves. If it is not delegated to the federal government, it is reserved to the states. So remember, we're learning why Alabama has a right to say, shall not be infringed, even to the federal government. Because it created it. But more than that, what power does the federal government actually hold? See, we only delegated power to the federal government. We didn't surrender that power. And we delegated a few and defined number of powers. So what power rests in the federal government? Well, guess what? We don't have to wait on the Supreme Court to issue their opinion on high. As a matter of fact, their opinion is irrelevant and inapplicable if it doesn't match this one. Because this one comes from James Madison. James Madison, whom history deems to be the father of the Constitution. Let me ask you a simple question, because we're a society who loves experts. Wouldn't the father of the Constitution have more authority on the proper application of the Constitution than somebody wearing a black robe in Washington, D.C. 250 years later? Well, James Madison wrote this. It's from Federalist 45, and he says the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those that remain in the states are numerous and indefinite. Now, he doesn't wait for us to figure out what that is. He tells us that the powers delegated to the federal government will be exercised principally on foreign objects, war, peace, negotiation, foreign commerce. He goes on to say the power of taxation will mostly come from this foreign commerce. Now hold on just a second. Remember, I told you to memorize to remember a list, right? war, peace, negotiation, and commerce. Where was that list before? Where? In the Declaration of Independence. With power that belonged to whom? The states. Look at this. Madison says the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are these. Well, those powers originally rested with the states. So that tells us something very important. Who delegated this power to the federal government? The states. Do you know how important of a fact that is? And it all originates with the understanding of this word delegate. To delegate something is a temporary transfer of trust or authority or responsibility from a higher power to a lower power. Now, this is not my opinion. We have all just agreed by looking at the facts and the documents and the words of the men who created themselves that the states delegated power to the federal government, which means by the definition of delegation, the states are the higher power and the federal government is the lower power. Are you beginning to see the authority that rests in the state of Alabama superior to the power of the federal government? So we know war, peace, negotiation, foreign commerce, these are the powers that are delegated to the federal government. They are specifically enumerated in their authority through the Constitution. So what powers are reserved to the states? All of them. That's what Madison says. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects. What does all mean? I mean, we have to have these discussions, you realize, because we have people in Washington, D.C. who want to redefine the meaning of the word is. Right? So all means all. To all the power, all the objects which in the rare event. Is that what it says? The extraordinary circumstances. No. In the ordinary course of affairs, we're talking about the power that is reserved to Alabama. Everything that happens in the ordinary course of affairs that affects the lives, the liberties, the properties of the people, the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state are powers that are reserved to you in Alabama. So what about the EPA, the FDA, and the Bureau of Land Management? Wouldn't that be a power reserved? Wouldn't that be the properties of the people? Reserved to the states. What about the Department of Education, Health and Human Services, USDA, and the FDA? That would be the lives of the people, right? What about the FBI, the DHS, the FCC, the SEC, the FAA, and any other three letters you can string together? I'm trying to show you all of these executive agencies are exercising unlawfully power that is reserved to the states. What about the ATF? It is a power reserved to the states, which means shall not be infringed. The very existence of these executive agencies, the very acquisition of the power that they attempt to exercise is a clear violation of the Constitution, the principles of liberty, and shall not be infringed. That's right. And it's right there in writing. Words have power. How many of you believe words have power? That word delegate, how many of you realized how powerful that word really was? Showing us that the federal government is the lower power and that the states are the higher power. But that word reserved has just as much force and control. That word reserved means to exercise dominion over a thing to the exclusion of all others. If there's a chair on the stage that says reserved to Chris Ann Hall and someone else sits in that chair, what do I have the right to do? Kick him out, right? Because it's reserved to me. I exercise dominion, ownership over that to me, if the sign says reserved to Chris Ann Hall, and someone else sits in that chair, and I don't have the right to kick them out, is the chair really reserved? No, then you're speaking on meaningless terms. The 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated by the Constitution to the federal government are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Why? Because you control your state. If your state is out of control, you can't blame President Trump for that. You can't blame Barack Obama for that. If you do not have direct control over your governor, over your attorney general, over your state legislators, a direct control that results in the securing of your liberties, not the diminishing of them, we have nobody to blame but ourselves. Because as you've seen, the majority of the power that rests in government rests at the state and local level. The federal government has very few and defined powers. So here's the thing. Reserved means ownership, which means the powers that are reserved to the states are owned by the states. It means that they have the right to say no to anyone who is trying to infringe upon the power that is reserved to the state. Can Illinois tell Alabama how to run its government? Can France tell Alabama how to run its government? Well, guess what? In the internal affairs of Alabama, Washington, D.C. is just as foreign as France and Illinois. And if you can't say no to Washington, D.C. to secure your reserved power, then you don't have the right to say no to anyone. You have a duty to protect the powers of the state because they are reserved to you. And if they are not reserved, they are open to anyone, even the United Nations. If they are not reserved, and the federal government can come to Alabama and say, we're going to run your education, we're going to run your health, we're going to run your land, we're going to run your farms, we're going to run your businesses, we're going to regulate your firearms. If the federal government can just pick up and wield against the state of Alabama a power that has not been rightfully delegated to them, what is the limit to the federal government's power? If they are not limited by the specific terms of the Constitution, what is their limit? None. None at all. They are a totalitarian government. And if the states must simply acquiesce to whatever power the federal government wishes to exercise in the state of Alabama because someone in the federal government said, we interpret the Constitution to mean we have the power to do this. Are the states sovereign? Are the states sovereign? No. Not if they have to just give in to whatever the federal government says. They are not. You are reduced to becoming the colony of Alabama. What corrects that? Recognizing that Alabama is the higher power and the federal government is the lower power, and saying, shall not be infringed. It's just that simple. Shall not be infringed. So, what happens when the federal government is exercising power that has not been delegated to them by the Constitution? Thomas Jefferson explains this to us. He says, whenever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. Remind me of your name, sir. Yeah. Eddie. That's right, Eddie. We're going to pretend that I've just stolen Eddie's car. Okay? And while we're going to pretend, Eddie owns an Alfa Romeo 4C Coupe. My new favorite car. Is that good? Okay. Do I have the authority to drive Eddie's car? No. Do I have the authority to sell Eddie's car? No, because my power over Eddie's car was never legally delegated. If I sell Eddie's car, is it a legally binding sale? Absolutely not. The power was not legally delegated. That means any act I exercise over Eddie's vehicle is unauthoritative, void, and of no force. Do you see what Thomas Jefferson is explaining to us? That when the federal government enters the state of Alabama with the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, with the Federal Bureau of Land Management, with the Federal Department of Interior, with the Federal ATF, they are stealing power from Alabama. The ATF is not only unconstitutional, every federal gun law is not only unconstitutional, it is unlawful and it is criminal. When Gun Owners Association says that they're thieves, I wonder if Americans really understand that they're being most literal in that fact. They are stealing from you because they are violating the supreme law of the land. And all you gotta know is, shall not be infringed. What are the states supposed to do when the federal government, how do you act? How do you say shall not be infringed? How do you enforce shall not be infringed? Well, James Madison also explains that to us. He says, in the case of deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of powers not granted, because every time the federal government exercises one power that has not been delegated, it is always dangerous. Because one power exercised not granted creates an unlimited, undefined federal government. He says, the states have the right to interpose. Now that word interpose means most literally to eclipse, to stand in between. The states, he says, they have a right to stand between the federal government's unlawful exercise of undelegated power to the protection of the rights and the liberties of the people. Why do they have the right to do that? Because those powers are reserved to them. They have the right to say, get out of my chair. You don't belong there. But notice he doesn't stop there, does he? He says not only do the states have a right, they are duty bound. Now we know the states have a right to tell the federal government, no, you can't exercise that power here, because it is reserved to us by law. But why would they be duty bound? Well, let's return to our Declaration of Independence, because it tells us why our state governments have a duty to say no. Remember, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator. Government, legislator, maybe their governor, their creator. See, rights are not granted. They are realized, they are recognized, and they are secured, but they are not granted by government. This is, are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. This is the Declaration of Independence, the announcement of the creation of our states. And they're telling us that the only reason we are creating these states, just one reason for the creation of our states, is to secure our rights. And any governor who allows the state, or allows the federal government to exercise undelegated power in that state, any legislator, any sheriff who allows the federal government to exercise undelegated power within their jurisdiction is failing to accomplish the sole purpose for their existence. And then we kind of got to ask ourselves, why do we even have state governments? I mean, seriously, why don't we dissolve the complication, declare Alabama a colony, and go on to be a kingdom like like they want us to be? Why? Because we know that our rights are gifted to us from God. We know that we have not only the right, the power, but we have the duty to self-governance, and we have the power to say, shall not be infringed. Because these words either mean something or they don't. Shall not be infringed. Shall not be infringed is not the power to regulate. It is the contrary to the power of regulation. Every single federal law is in violation of that rule when it comes to the Second Amendment, when it comes to the First Amendment, when it comes to the Third, the Fourth, the Fifth, the Seventh, Sixth, the Seventh, and Eighth Amendments. Violations of shall not be infringed. How do the states interpose? We know they're supposed to eclipse the federal government, but how is that supposed to work? Thomas Jefferson explains that to us. He says, the several states who formed the Constitution being what? Sovereign and independent. Do not forget the sovereign and independent part, because there are people whom I lovingly call federal supremacists who want to always assert that the federal government is superior to the states. Some of them will actually agree that Alabama can stand up to unconstitutional federal laws, but they'll tell you that Alabama can only stand against those laws if 36 other states agree with you. If you have to wait for one state to agree with you, are you sovereign? Are you independent? Remember, Alabama is sovereign and independent. And that is the truth that gives you not only the power, but the duty to say, shall not be infringed. And that's what he's saying here, that they have the unquestionable right to judge of the infractions on the Constitution. Why do they have the unquestionable right? Because they wrote it. They ratified it into law. And that a nullification by those sovereignties, who are the sovereignties? States. A nullification by the states is the rightful remedy. What is nullification? Nullification is simply the states saying, we will not comply with your unconstitutional, your unlawful, your criminal acts of law, because our Constitution says shall not be infringed. Nullification is not the states acting lawlessly by breaking federal law. Nullification is the states enforcing the supreme law of the land when the federal government is violating the law. And the ATF violates the supreme law of the land. The Federal Department of EPA violates the supreme law of the land. The Federal Bureau of Land Management violates the supreme law of the land. And the states have a duty to say no. And that's your power. That's how you demand no compromise. You demand no compromise by standing on the truth and the legal authority that the power is reserved to you. And any other exercise of that power is unlawful and criminal. Shall not be infringed. It either means something or it does not. We must not simply hear this. We must know it. We must believe it. We must demand it. We must expect it. And we must know that it is ours to self-govern so that we do not live in a kingdom in the colony of Alabama. Some might try to tell you that the Supreme Court has already determined that the states cannot nullify federal law. I will tell you that is not only wrong, but it is ridiculous. And even James Madison says so. I know this is a long quote, but let me tell you what. Nothing is clearer than this. Help me with this. He says the decisions of the judiciary, if the decisions of the judiciary be raised above the authority of the sovereign parties to the Constitution. Who are the sovereign parties to the Constitution? So let's read it like that. If decisions of the judiciary be raised above the authority of the states, dangerous powers not delegated may not only be usurped and executed by other departments, but the judicial department also may exercise or sanction dangerous powers beyond the grant of the Constitution. Consequently, the ultimate right of the parties to the Constitution, who are the ultimate right of the states to judge whether the compact, it's not a theory, it's a fact, has been dangerously violated, must extend to violations by one delegated authority as well as by another, by the judiciary as well as by the executive or the legislative. I want to show you something. Madison is reminding us of some very important things. Number one, the states created the Constitution. Number two, when they created the Constitution, they created three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. Now, we've already determined by fact that the states, by delegating power to the federal government, they are the higher power and the federal government is the lower power, which means the only power that the judiciary has is a power that has been delegated to the judiciary by whom? The states, which means the states are the higher power and the judiciary is the lower power. Not only that, the judiciary is part of the federal government, right? If part of the federal government can determine the power of the federal government, then what is the limit to the federal government's power? Just whatever they want, right? Remember, I've stolen Eddie's car. Does Eddie have to sue me to get his car back? No, he simply provides the title deed to the vehicle to the local officials. They have to, by law, as the proper delegated authority over that car, they must return it to him. Let me ask you something. Do the states have to sue the federal government to get their power back? After it's already been reserved to the states, where specific powers only are enumerated and delegated to the federal government, do the states have to sue the federal government to stop them from exercising their power? No. Absolutely not. They simply have to show the title deed to their power. What is the title deed to the state's power? They must stand on the Constitution. Do you know states suing the federal government to get their power back is not only unnecessary, it is ridiculous, and it is dangerous. For the states to sue the federal government to keep the ATF out of their state is like Eddie suing me to get his car back, showing up in court, and finding out that the judge and the jury are all my family members. Right? Because the states are suing the federal government where? In federal court with the judges that are appointed by? See, how could we ever expect that a federal court with judges that are appointed by the federal government would ever side with the state in a dispute between the states and the federal government? I mean, sure, there's going to be some good moral judges that might throw us a bone every now and again, but we ought not expect it, because that's not how human nature works. And that is not the check and balance that was established by the designers of our Constitution. The check and balance that was designed in the matter of the creation of our constitutional republic was the authority of the states to say, no, we are your creator. We are the ones who delegated to you that power. We have the ultimate authority. We are the higher power, and you are the lower power. It's like an employer-employee relationship. If I have a restaurant, and in my restaurant I make burgers, fries, and shakes, law, right? Now, in spite of what you may have heard, I am not Superwoman. So I have to hire an employee to make the burgers, the fries, and the milkshakes. What happens if the burger guy comes in one day and says, I ain't making your burgers? Do I have to hang a sign up on the door explain to my customer that we're not going to have burgers today because my burger guy doesn't want to make burgers? No, what do? I fire him. So now I fired the burger guy, he walks out of the door. Do I have to hang a sign on the door that says, I'm so sorry, customers, I had to fire my burger guy today, and when he left, he took the burger power with him? Well, of course not, because I am the higher power, and the burger guy is the lower power, and when I fired him, the power came back to me. What happens if the burger guy comes in one day and kicks the fry guy off the grease and says, I ain't making burgers, I'm making fries? Can he do that? No, why? Because I never delegated fry power to him. By being the higher power, it's my responsibility. Pick the fry guy up off the floor, dust him off, put him on the grease, and tell the burger guy to hit the road. At which point, I have the power to make the burgers myself or to hire somebody else to do it. I want you to see the power over regulating your firearms was never delegated to the federal government. They're trying to make fries when you told them to make burgers. Because, right, they don't want to protect your states from foreign invasion anymore, do they? It is your responsibility, Alabama, to tell the federal government, do what we told you to do, only what we told you to do, and if you refuse, you are fired and we'll take care of it ourselves. Madison, in 1789, reinforcing this understanding, this truth, that Alabama is the greatest protector of your rights, that your governor is the greatest protector of your rights, that your state legislators are the greatest protectors of your rights. He says, besides the securities that we've created, your rights will be enforced by the federal government. Why? Because the state legislators will jealously and closely watch the operations of this government. Pop quiz, everybody. You know the answer. Why do the state legislators have an obligation to closely and jealously watch the operation of the federal government? To protect their reserved powers, right? He says not only will they jealously and closely watch the operation of this government, your state legislators will be able to resist with more effect every assumption of power than any other power on earth can do. Your ultimate protection of your rights is not some Supreme Court opinion, and you're not even obligated to wait around for one. If you're waiting around for the Supreme Court to tell you that you have a right to keep and bear arms, you do not have a right to keep and bear arms. You have a permission to keep and bear arms from an oligarchy of 9 kings and queens in black robes. He says the greatest opponents to a federal government admit the state legislators to be the sure guardians of the people's liberty. Your state and local governments are supposed to be the greatest opponents to the federal government, not their best friends, co-workers, and on the same payroll. Somebody's going to try to say, well, KrisAnne is just talking all this nonsense, but the Supremacy Clause tells us that the federal government is superior to the state constitution and state laws. How many of you heard that? Until we started complaining on my radio show, Google used to say that. When you did a Google search on the Supremacy Clause, you know how they usually send up a little shortcut of a definition that they found somewhere on the internet? Before we started complaining on the KrisAnne Hall television show and radio show and on Facebook, when you search for the Supremacy Clause, Google's little go-to definition said that the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Section 2 of the Constitution, determined that the federal government and federal laws were superior to the state constitution and state laws. It is absolutely not true. They tell you that because they want you to believe that the Supremacy Clause was placed within the Constitution to put the states in their box. It's the exact opposite. This is the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause was not created to put the states in submission of the federal government. The Supremacy Clause was put in there to put the federal government in submission to the Constitution. Because the only time the states and the courts of the states are subject to the laws created by federal government is when the federal laws are made in pursuance to the Constitution. Do you see that? The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, but the laws of the United States and regulations now, because that's how we work today, are only the supreme law of the land when they are made in pursuance to the Constitution. Is the ATF made in pursuance to the Constitution? Absolutely not. Then they are not the supreme law of the land. The Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Section 2, was created to keep the federal government in its limited and defined box, and even Alexander Hamilton says so in Federalist 78. He says, "No law, therefore, contrary to the Constitution can be valid." I have to ask you a question. What obligation do the people of Alabama have to submit themselves to Title 18, Title 18 U.S.C. 42, Section 900s, all the federal gun laws? What obligation do you have to submit yourself to a law that is no law at all? Well, the only obligation is the one that you impose upon yourself right here. Because legally and constitutionally speaking, that law is invalid, void, and of no force. And that is not Chris Ann Hall's opinion. That is Alexander Hamilton's opinion. That is James Madison's opinion. And that, by the way, is the opinion of every single delegate who ratified Article 6, Section 2 in the Constitution. It has only been since our most recent bout of educated ignorance that we have come to accept that our states are colonies once again. Shall not be infringed means we must refuse to comply. Because you see, who controls the federal government? It's not the Supreme Court. They are the federal government. We cannot be sitting around waiting for the president to control the federal government, whether you like him or not. He is the federal government. Nullification is not the states acting unlawfully. Nullification is the states enforcing the supreme law of the land. I want you to see what Jefferson says. Jefferson is warning us what are the consequences of Alabama submitting to every demand of the federal government. All of these unconstitutional executive agencies, what are the consequences? He says, when all government, domestic and foreign, in as little as great things shall be drawn to Washington as the center of all power, it will render powerless the checks provided of one government on another. Notice he didn't say one branch on the other, or one department on the other. He said one government on the other. What government is supposed to be checking and balancing the federal government? France? No, the states. Look what he says. If the states look with apathy on the silent descent of their government into the gulf which is to swallow all. Isn't that a beautiful euphemism of Washington, D.C.? The gulf which is to swallow all. He says, we have only to weep over a human character formed uncontrollable but by a rod of iron. Because when our states refuse to defend our liberties, when our states refuse to exercise their authority of self-governance and reserved power, they are simply admitting that Alabama is not a state, but a colony. And the only way you preserve liberty in a colony is by picking up the sword. Even the Supreme Court cannot deny the fact of the sovereignty of the states and the power and the duty of the states to say, we will not comply because it says shall not be infringed. This is the Chief Supreme Court Justice, John Roberts. This is taken from his first Affordable Care Act opinion. He is shouting out to the states, you don't have to comply. You don't even have to try to compromise. You don't even have to change anything. You simply refuse. And look what he says. In the typical case, the extraordinary rare case? No. In the typical case, the everyday case, we, who? The federal government, look to the states to defend their prerogatives, their reserved powers, by adopting the simple expedient of not yielding. That is the definition of nullification. We will not comply because it says shall not be infringed. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States says, in the typical case, we look the states to do this. Why? Because the states are separate and independent sovereigns. Hey, Alabama, don't you think it's about time you start acting like a sovereign government? Don't you think it's time Alabama stand up and protect your rights? Instead of acquiescing and just sitting around and waiting for somebody to bestow a privilege upon you? The power is yours. It is not theirs. It is yours. It is a shall not be infringed power. And you have the responsibility to make sure it happens. Even the Supreme Court cannot hide from these facts. And this is the truth that every legislator in Alabama must know. This is the truth that every sheriff in Alabama must know, because your sheriffs have the authority to say to the federal government, you have no jurisdiction in my county. And that was even recognized by the Supreme Court in a case called Mack Prince v. U.S. Your sheriffs have a duty to say, no, you cannot come here and exercise this power because I've taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, which gives me an obligation to protect the rights of my people. This is the truth that every citizen of Alabama must know. And I believe that this is the truth that BamaCarry knows. So we have a decision to make. Do you trust government, now and in the future, to never take away your rights, to never oppress you, and never try to rob you of your liberty? Do you? Then the gun debate discussion is over. Do you recognize the power that you have to tell the federal government no? Do you? Then exercise it. Demand it. Expect it. Because with the power to self-govern is the responsibility to self-govern. And you have the power and the authority to do so. And you don't need anybody's permission, because God has already given it to you. God bless you guys. Thank you very much.
All right, can I get a couple of board members to come up and help me up here while we draw for our prizes? We're gonna make this pretty quick because we're running kind of behind. I guess we could order out a truckload of pizzas or something, but in the interest of time, I'm just gonna go ahead and pull these out myself. And the first three things we're gonna draw for are the handguns that we have up here to give away, right here. And we're gonna lay it right up here. We're gonna go ahead and draw for them. There's the ticket for that one. There's a ticket for the next one, whichever one. There's a ticket for the next one. I'm going to do my best to remember who donated these prizes, but I've been up for a long time, and I slept on a rollaway bed last night at the Hampton Inn.
Cut about 3 quarts of wood too.
Yeah.
That he did.
It was like sleeping on a bed of newspapers and somebody threw a bucket of bolts underneath it. But anyway, we're going to do the best we can. Let's start right down here. Let's give away this box here. This one goes to number 002802. 002802. Going once. 002802. Going twice. It's hard to get just one of those. 002642. 002642.
Got it? No.
002642.
Right here? Come on.
Come on, get it. Or run it to it. Run to it, that's okay. I was beginning to think these tickets were defective. Here you go, Bob. The guy in the green right there. All right, I'm just going to call the last 4 numbers. Gun control, isn't about guns, it's about control. We just heard all about that. 2790. 2790. Look at there, Lester. Got this, give away that. Let's give away this and this and keep the knife and we'll give away next. All right, Mr. Willis Lee brought this. It's an NRA bag and a hat, $28.35. $28.35. $28.35. There she is. Moving right along. I'm not going to say this is a one-off, but it almost is. It's a BamaCarry plaque. I can't remember who did that, but we had several of those made. This is for number 2612. 2612. 2612. 2649. 2649. There she is right there. 2649. We got an NRA knife right here. 2843. 2843. 2843. There he is right behind Chuck. Okay. Got an NRA Second Amendment plaque, 2716. 2716. Don't get excited over there, Ann. Just, it's okay. It's funny, we gave, at the Tuscaloosa group meeting, we gave away like a $1,200 AR down there one day, and the guy said, that's me. We got another glass, says pro gun, no ifs, ands, or buts. This is from Cheryl Gainey from Walker County Group, 2760. There she is right there, 2760. What you got next? Okay, this is a omnivore holster. I can't remember. Ron, who gave that? I can't remember. What'd you say? Alabama Tideland Pond for number 2795. 2795. There he is right there. And that's from this is from Last Resort Guns. A couple of gun orders here for number 2738. 2738. There she is, the invisible lady. This is from Sheepdog Firearms Training Center. This is in Trussville. 2 free range passes for $27.53. $27.53. There you go. You look like you need a little practice. Go ahead and get it in there. Hold on, man. Got an NRA pocket knife here for number 2708. 2708. 2708. If y'all know who's got that, y'all tell them they want a pistol. And it's not here. We're going to try again. 2822. 2822.
Going once.
Wow. 2801. 2801. It's a nice pocket knife, actually. It's got the snake on it. Don't tread on me. Man, I can't hardly believe that. 2759. Thank you. Thank you. Give my hand. I mean, we finally got a winner on that. That's great. Okay. Here's a gift card from Last Resort Guns. From Last Resort Guns. This is in Trussville. Is that right? That was right, isn't it? Madison, my bad. Number 2618, $20 gift card.
Dan Warren.
Dan, y'all make him walk up here. We got it.
You want to see if they want to try that? Ask if they want
Just
to
to
try
do what you want to. Go see if you want to be fine. I got a genuine kangaroo wallet bead. Wallet. 2830. 2830. 2830.
That's not the model, that's the ticket number.
Yeah. Nobody. 2682. 2682. There's Jennifer. Take it. Yeah, that's going to be a shirt. That goes to Jennifer right there. Okay. The next female name we call, we got a special prize just for you. Okay? So whatever we hold up, if you're a lady, we got something special for you. Let's do this. Gun case, $26.85. $26.85.
That's there.
Hey, okay. Come on up here, young lady. Okay. I know that you probably never had a pen this expensive, but this is a handmade, custom handmade fountain pen that's convertible to a roller ball, and it comes with a special thing to hold